Hi, my name is Shannon Babb. As a heads up, I am a lip reader, so if I can't see your lips, I didn't hear what you just said. The reason I'm on this panel is I have spent 3 field seasons about 300 miles north of the Arctic Circle doing polar research, and I'm currently training for an Antarctic expedition in 2021.
That is amazing and awesome. I defer all questions to Shannon. I only spent 6 years in the Antarctica, and I ate all my comrades.
I have some friends who've been to Antarctica, but what I can talk about is how people that are socially or functionally isolated develop mythologies and taboos of their own.
I have a doctorate in mythology, so I guess that's why I'm here, even though Antarctica has no mythology.
Self-moderate. Take us off, Shannon. Tell us about your research. How long have you been in Antarctica?
So I was on the opposite pole, but I can tell you that there is a linked mythology between the 2 poles. And it is an oral mythology, and it's controlled by what we call the Arctic Terns. Arctic Terns are people that are not just, we go to the poles crazy, because it takes a special type of crazy person to decide, I want to move to Antarctica for a while. These people, they spend the Antarctic summer in Antarctica, and then when it's winter in Antarctica, they fly to the opposite pole, and they work polar stations in the Arctic. They see more sunlight than any other human beings on Earth, and they are crazy. So what types of questions brought you guys to this panel? What types of things are you interested in hearing about?
Maybe just kind of explain what even it is, because I know that I, for one, have no idea what to even got it on, and I'm just kind of learn about
it. The explanation of the panel is if a people settled in Antarctica, what would the mythology be like? There's a lot of presuppositions behind that question. And as an academic, I can, mythology is derived from an oral culture. So you're assuming that the people who arrive in Antarctica aren't, modern. If it were modern people settling Antarctica, they wouldn't develop a mythology. They would build a boat to get out. But look, ancient mythologies are always constructed around certain themes and templates. Their natural environment is a huge influence in how they create mythology, including the cosmology. So, Nick will talk, I guess, about isolationism and how that develops. But your food sources, and I don't know, fish and fish.
There's more to eat down there than fish.
Oh, I would like to know. Lichen and fish. So you have your food sources, your seasons, how you build a sustainable, survivable village. All of that is going to get imprinted in your stories, because your stories are going to be passed down to repeat how you survive in the land. And so, if a mythology does develop, you'll have a god of a certain food source that will track that food source. When does that food source appear? What star appears on the horizon when that food source appears? That god then becomes associated with that star, that turn of the season or sun, and that food source, and on it goes. So this is how a mythology will start developing in oral cultures. And then there are, of course, religious concerns, death and rebirth. What are their ideas about that, and how is that influenced by the landscape around them, including the sky? So that starts entering into their mythology. So the natural geographic constraints, how you survive, the philosophical, theological, metaphysical ideas that come from that, all that starts to get built up into mythology.
So I think the question on everybody's minds, given that Antarctica has never truly been inhabited by a sort of pre-modern culture, is how do they get their own mythology? I mean, we've got these, even Iridium satellite phones are almost cheap at this point. I mean, not for normal people, but you could afford one if you had to. So how do you end up with a mythology? How do you end up with a set of beliefs or taboos or stories that people tell to each other that don't get shared with the broader world? You know, how do you do that in the age of Facebook and the internet and phones? There must be something to make people wish to isolate this, something that makes people say, I'm not going to write this down or talk about it with people who do not share this with me. So I happen to work in one of those areas where we have our own language and have our own mythos that we do not share with other people. I will tell you that we have it, but I won't talk about it with people. I work with really sick kids, and sometimes things go the wrong way and sometimes things go the right way. And there's an element of risk, there's an element of taboo because you know what happens with really sick kids sometimes. And there's an element of, well, frankly, the ways that you talk and the things you do are things that would appear alien to other people. Again, I've had some friends who went the Antarctic and Arctic, and the way people live up there is a little bit different when you're isolated, have the same companions for a long period of time, and have a whole bunch of people with a whole lot of degrees around each other. So that's what I would think about when I'm thinking about how you get a mythology in a modern society that has theoretically open communication. What would stop you from talking to other people? Mortality, fear of misunderstanding, things like that. So I'm going to pass it on to our Antarctic person, or Arctic, sorry, pre-Antarctic person is what I meant to say.
So there are definitely some stories that are kind of told as warnings. And these are shared between both poles. And there are ones that you can read up more about and you will realize why they are constantly referenced. One is the Greely Expedition. Has anyone heard of the Greely Expedition? So, cannibalism is a huge taboo when you get into the Arctic. It's true for pretty much every Arctic culture. And doing my research on the ones closest to the Antarctic, it's also a taboo there. It's a real big taboo amongst polar explorers. And a lot of that ends up going back to the Greely Expedition. It was a bunch of scientists, and then they threw in a bunch of army folks. They left them on the top of Greenland. They were going to come back the next year, and the ice pack did not agree with them. They were stuck up there for 4 years. They did not have food for 4 years. There was cannibalism. And you can tell anyone the Greely Expedition, and if they're a polar explorer, they'll give you the, yeah, we're not doing that. Another example, I'm sure all of you have heard of Shackleton. Everyone wants to be a Shackleton-type leader versus a Scott-like leader. Because someone who is always focused on the goal will get you killed. And you do not have a lot of room for error. I know personally, I have been medevaced from the Arctic. It was not an easy experience. And because you were on the edge, you tell those stories. And most of the stories that are told year after year, or the ones that are kind of part of the base culture, are warning tales. They are, deciding that you are going to get drunk and ride around camp wearing nothing but a golf cart does not end well when you are in an area with lots of mosquitoes. So it's those types of stories. They don't make don't have a lot of context unless you've been to the Arctic. But if you've been swarmed by mosquitoes in the middle of nowhere, suddenly making sure you're wearing more than a golf cart makes sense.
I always drive naked in a golf cart. Look, so mythology is a really interesting, mythology is a product of oral societies, and it's a repetition of cosmic fact. I talk about how oral peoples pass down information. I call it the oral imprinting press. They have a printing press, but it's not a printing press. It's a way to pass down traditions. And it starts with their environment of above and below. I mean, we've forgotten how closely they watch the sky, but obviously the environment on the ground is also incredibly important. So I think in Antarctic mythology, surviving in that landscape would be one of the most important pieces of information passed down from generation to generation. And so you would have to know how to fish. You would have to know how to whale. You would have to know how to build boats. You would have to know if there's a better time of the year to go out in your boat, right? You would have to know, what can you eat other than fish?
Okay, you have 25 plants.
She was
In
driving
Antarctica.
naked in a golf cart. Just
Hey.
take the source for what it is.
I was not there, but I did witness, and I wish I didn't.
I tried wearing a cape.
25 plants. Yeah, you can't eat any of them. The tallest plant is a plant called a tussock grass. They are your worst enemy. They break bones. You do not like them. You avoid them. You're going to be relying on the sea. You have over 100 different species of seabird that nest in Antarctica. You have lots of marine mammals, and marine mammals are really great as a food source. If you can get one whale that feeds your community and it has all of the nutrients. Whale skin, incredibly, incredibly high in vitamin C. That's how you stave off scurvy when you're in the poles. You have seals. That's going to be your source of fur. It's going to be your source of floats. You can make from the bladders of seals. That's how you can build boats. You're going to have to deal with bones because of those 25 plants, do you think any of them are trees? Nope. Lots of lichen. You have penguins. Penguins are edible. They do not taste particularly good, but they are edible.
Do seals taste particularly good? This sounds horrible. I wouldn't make it a week.
Okay,
I'd eat myself.
your taste buds change as you start going above and below the Arctic Circle. I am normally a vegetarian. I know people that are vegans that have been on the same basis as I am, and they try to work with any of your food things. 4 weeks in, I have had a good friend who is a vegan turn to me when we had a lot of little ptarmigans with baby chicks. They're a small bird that looks kind of like a chicken. Turn, drooling, saying, chicken nuggets. You have vegans that are trying to get off their vegan meal plan and trade steaks with people. Because you're craving the protein, you're craving the fat. Nothing tastes as good after a really hard day as a quarter-sized piece of well blubber. You don't even have to cook it. You crave it. It is so incredibly delicious, and your entire body warms up. And do you know how to take down a well when you're in a pre-industrial society?
I should imagine you go to the drive-through window.
So this one is a task for you younger kids. Because the adults, they take spears, they put on the spears, there's a rope attached with usually the bladder of a seal, so you have a float. And when the whale tires out, it's the kid's job to take a handful of ash, to get tossed on the back of the whale, and to stick their hand down the blowhole of the well and let go of the ash and hold on as long as they can before letting go and popping back to the surface. And that causes the whale to sneeze underwater. And that is how you can hunt a whale without using any modern technology.
Tell us more.
I know some people who have actually done it. There are Inuit people that are now much older than I have that grew up being tossed on the back of whales. It was kind of a rite of passage. And you would dare each other to see which of you would be the bravest to actually get in the boat with the parents.
Isn't there a nice little fire and Pinocchio sitting there and a little cricket? And you're having like a meal, chicken nuggets, right?
Wrong type of whale.
Oh. Fair. Nick, why don't you add something to that? My mind's blown.
Well, I think I don't have much that I can say to kind of challenge that, but she does bring up a point about edge people, people living on the edge of human habitation. So we don't know much about Antarctica, but we do know about a place called Tierra del Fuego, the land of fire, which is extremely cold and extremely close to Antarctica. This is the extreme south end of Chile. You know, basically you can see Antarctica from where these people are living. And so all of their mythology has to do with the fact that they live on the edge. I mean, all cultures have some things that they face. Geographically or ecologically speaking, there's always some sort of danger. But when you're living this close to the edge of human habitation, everything is danger. And that's still true in a modern society. Living in Antarctica, you can still die of exposure very easily. The only way you can shower is to first collect a giant 55-gallon tub of snow that then gets melted into water that lasts you for about a 30-second or 45-second shower. She was mentioning meal plans. There are incredibly tight tolerances for things here. So these people become very modern edge peoples. That puts you in an interesting place where you have to live on the edge, but at the same time, risk-taking is not actually valued for its own sake. Because, well, like you mentioned, being medevac, that's not fun, that's not easy, and that puts everybody at risk with the amount of manpower involved. So there's this combination of complete laissez-faire about your own safety, or rather of bad outcomes, while at the same time being very driven by sticking to certain ways of doing things. Now the challenge here is that you can end up with a whole bunch of highly educated people taught to look for patterns who are already being trained to be highly meticulous, who then see patterns where they aren't, right? That's why we have this whole fancy thing called statistics, which no one bothers to use. I teach child psychiatry. It's amazing how much data is out there that child psychiatrists don't know about. And it's just mind-boggling. It's like, no, they figured that out in 1982, a year before I was born, that was a bad idea. People are like, what? Google. But you also see people develop their own superstitions, their own ways of doing things that they justify with those fancy degrees and that fancy training. So, like, hilariously, there's only one med I'm allowed to use on the lung transplant kits. I'm not sure if I decided that we were sticking to that one med for depression or if the pulmonologist did, and we actually recently went to dinner to try to figure out who did it. But we couldn't figure out why we had decided that was the only depression med we were going to use in these kits. But we've been operating like it's a guiding principle. And I don't know if that's something you can comment on, is sort of like quasi-regulations or quasi-procedural things, because I think that's an important part of mythology in a modern society, is procedures that we think have a point that really don't.
I'm trying to think of some examples that if they got back to people I know, they wouldn't, like, hunt me down. Again, Small, close society definitely has some clicks. But there are some superstitions that we have built up. We name our rubber boats. These rubber boats, we pull them in helicopters, we strap them on the backs of people and send them out into the tundra. They don't last very long. We go through about 6 of them in a 2-month season. But you always name them, because if you don't name them, you will drop an important piece of scientific equipment off the side of it, or your notebook off the side of it, or your lab colleague that does not know how to swim off the side of it.
Can I bring a colleague to one of your expeditions?
I do not know who came up with the we have to name them, but we all have to name them. You always bring the pump. I'm in the boat with you on the rubber raft. That one is a little more practical because I have a lot of data points of one person taking samples and the other person badly pumping up the raft as it's trying to deflate under us. And I'm still not sure why on a project involving a whole bunch of limnologists, people who study lakes, they decided it was a good idea to have half the crew not be able to swim. But that's been another thing that has happened a lot in the past. So those myths, they have been naming rafts, we know because of pictures, almost since the founding of the research base I was at. It's just something that we do, and we will have our PIs, the principal investigators that were researchers before us, actually yell at us if they have a picture and the boat has not been christened. Because it is that ingrained in how that system works.
So let me just sort of give a preliminary example of how a Antarctica mythology might work. I mean, I don't know because there's no such thing, but you know, let's go for this. Let's say you have a food source, and it's you know, it's cyclical. Maybe it's a sea life or a bird that nests during a certain part of the year. So you want to track that part of the year with that food source. In an oral society, you assign a deity. That deity, male or female, is now going to be associated with that food source, right? Now, to get this food source, you now need to serve the deity. So how do you serve the deity? Well, there's going to be a ritual associated with it and a story. And the story might be the origin of the food source. So now you're going to create a story. If you're creating mythology for your own world, you create a story that describes the origin of that food source or the origin of the deity. Okay? This is how mythology starts developing. Now, again, that food source is going to be tracked. So it's going to be associated either with the lunar cycle, solar cycle, or a star on the horizon that rises with the lunar cycle. So you perform your ritual to serve the deity when the star rises on the horizon. And when you perform that ritual, you tell your story about the origin of the food source. There is your entire mythological cycle right there, right? So that is how, so if you're creating your own world, this is sort of how mythology works. So that's how you would start integrating the story, the ritual, and the landscape around it, where the food source comes from, the time it comes, the cosmology behind it. Does that make sense? Right? So that's just one example of a food source. Now, what are the other, I mean, there's going to be taboos, right, of things you should not do living in the Antarctica, or else you will die. And what might those be? That might create a ritual and a story, right? The first person who ate Fred, cannibalism is a taboo, so we might have a mythology about it. On the other hand, Fred might have been tasty. Those chicken nugget tasting vegans are quite delicious in the Antarctica. So there's just a host of concerns, but they all follow a similar pattern of how do we serve the deity? The deity is going to be served in some sort of ritual where the myth is told about the concern, whether it's a food source, a religious idea, a taboo, right? So you're going to create your story, but it's going to be associated with the deity, with the landscape it's associated with, and often a cosmological aspect that times it. You know, this cycle of the moon, or, you know, there's going to be all kinds of stories about, I bet the sky down in Antarctica would be quite spectacular, right?
Not in the areas that are habitable.
No? Vast
So-
emptiness of nothing? Seal bladders?
So, when I read fiction about Antarctica, one of the things that drives me nuts is how they approach night. I do not know someone who has ever worked at the poles that view night as a good thing. Night is death. Night, even on a balmy day, is going to be around negative 30 degrees. Now, if you're in the interior, that might be negative 80. Now, the strip of Antarctica, there's only a few places that are inhabitable in Antarctica. You're looking at probably the Palmer Peninsula or areas where you have volcanic activity. Otherwise, you're pretty much doomed. Poor people who manage to get stuck at the South Pole, yep, they're goners. Write them off.
I hope I'm one of those. So how do you track your time?
So, during the winter, that strip happens to be right under what's called the aurora belt. It's never going to be purely dark in that area. Unless it's, when it gets dark, it means it's cloudy, which is bad. You want to be inside. You can land an aircraft without outside light under the aurora in the aurora belt. It's that bright. It casts shadows. It is that bright. When you look at, you really can't see a lot of stars. You can't really navigate with stars. You navigate by the moon, and you watch sun angles a lot. If you know where that rock is, you can measure shadows, because that's going to be your biggest way of tracking time. You're also going to track things like ice on and ice off, because those things are directly related to solar radiation, and they hit frighteningly close to the same time every single year. And when ice off happens, it happens in days. The rivers, and yes, Antarctica does have rivers. They are not big rivers, but they do have them. When the ice breaks off of them, suddenly you go from a frozen solid landscape to a landscape with running water. And you hear, and it's very unnerving when you're used to that silence, and all of a sudden you hear the landscape wake up. And so that's one of the ways that scientists track time.
That's cool.
So what types of questions do you guys have?
Talk more about hearing the landscape wake up. What does that mean?
So, and I'm going to be basing this off of some histories that have been kept by scientists, because there are some excellent, excellent journals. If you want to know what it's like to live in Antarctica, look at some of the accounts that they have written. That waking up, oftentimes the only thing that will overwinter in Antarctica, or as they say, the only two things that are stupid enough to overwinter in Antarctica are humans and penguins. Everything else, it's a fairly dead continent when it's in that cold, dark state, when nothing is happening except the aurora above you, which you can actually hear the aurora. It is an incredibly haunting sound. It's a very electronic crackling type sound. But scientists have finally proved what other scientists were telling them, and yes, the aurora does have a sound. You go from that quiet, nothing but the howling of the wind and the sound of snow on your shelter, to a period where even the wind dies down and the sun comes out, and you might hear a little bit of dripping, and then you hear crackling and cracking of the ice as that ice breaks up, and then you hear running water. Now imagine, you haven't heard running water for 9 months. Any liquid water that you have had during that 9 months, you had to use some sort of fat to melt, or you used body heat to melt. How joyous is that sound? Because up until that point, do you know what the scientists have been doing? The ones that are stuck measuring penguins out in the middle of nowhere? They're not taking a shower. They're rolling around in the snow, because you can take a snow bath to get the worst of the oils. You don't smell when you're in that kind of condition. It's too dry and it's too cold for the bacteria to grow. So if your socks get smelly, your answer is you actually pin them to the outside of the tent and it sterilizes it. That's what you do with your underwear as well. You do not have that many pairs to get you through the entire winter, because you're not getting picked up. Once you get dropped off, you're stuck.
So you said that the largest plant breaks bones. I'm imagining that if you eat it, like, your bones just get brittle. Otherwise, it's like hitting you and like breaking your bones.
So, tussocks, and again, scientists are very good at seeing them a great distance off so they can find another path to get around them. They grow like giant basketballs, and the ones in Antarctica can get up to 4 feet tall. And so you're walking, and they can create a plane that looks safe. And so you're walking across this field that you think is safe, and 3 steps in, you hit the spot that is the space between 2 tussocks. And it's not uncommon for your leg or your ankle to get caught, you to fall sideways and snap. They are the bane of doing field work.
That's why they have golf carts.
How do you deal with being in such a high-stress environment with the same people for such a long time?
So, for one thing, privacy is an illusion you give yourself. Everyone pretends that they have moments alone, which is interesting when you share a tent with 6 other people. The greatest amount of privacy I had doing field work was when I had the time to get out into the tundra. The next most privacy is when we were in our 2-story outhouses. These seats were only on the top level. They were 2 stories because that is the one building you want to find in a hurry in the middle of a snowstorm. I know a bunch of people chose to face it by, in their off hours, getting drunk. There's a big alcohol culture among researchers on both poles, although that brings a whole lot of other dangers. Games are really popular. Instead of Settlers of Catan, we actually had someone during a particularly bad fogged-in section period. They created an entire game called Researchers of Tussock, in which your power-ups included candy bars. You had an Arctic ground squirrel that had figured out, had coexisted with these scientists for so long, it had discovered how to undo zippers. And had passed this on from generation to generation, which is really dangerous. And so you create those inside jokes, you pass along books. None of the books have anything remotely to do with ice and snow. You do not read about ice and snow when you're in the middle of nowhere. You are reading about the Sahara Desert and how terrible it is to get marooned in the middle of the desert. Or you are in the middle of space and you have replicators and can get anything that you want. Those are the things that they end up looking for.
You brought up a comment about like kind of the pressure cooker environment when you're side by side with the same people day in and day out. And she brought up a good point with the illusion of privacy, is that there are very strong sort of mechanisms within a group in order to kind of maintain peace. I work with the same people 12 hours a day, 6 or more days a week, and have for 2 years. We have drank together, we eat our meals together, we talk about everything. Except I don't know a thing about any of their families, and they don't know a thing about my families. But these are some of my best friends on the planet. So oftentimes what you do is you create a shared culture in which you can avoid conflict, because that's a big part of why we do that. Is so there's no politics. We don't know anything about politics. We don't know anything about each other's kids. We don't need to know they go to the same elementary school and one of them was bullying the other one, right? But that also brings up another question, because there's often, like, in those kinds of situations, like the kind I'm in, you come in and you get shunned and then you just take a transfer to someone else. Or you've been there for a while and it turns out you're not quite dealing with the group and you take a transfer to somewhere else. But what happens on one of these expeditions where you are isolated and the only way off is medevac? And now I'm starting to wonder if medevac is always medevac.
There have been people that got sent home because they couldn't take it anymore. They do a lot of testing, sending you down to Antarctica. They do less when they send you up to the North Pole, simply because it's a little bit easier to get you on a Delta flight out. But we have something that we call hitting the wall. There is a point where you just can't take it anymore. You are stuck with the same people. And in my case, it was the same 100 people for a prolonged period of time, and someone will break. And we call hitting the wall. It's a perfectly acceptable temporary period of insanity. And during that, we create safe outlets for that insanity to kind of be released. And it's usually contagious when that insanity breaks loose. For example, one of the people, they hit the wall. They were frustrated, they didn't want to be there anymore. Next thing we knew, he had a mohawk. And a bunch of the guys decided, okay, we can support this. We know you have a mohawk because you only grow hair on the top of your head, but we have beards, we like the hair on our head, so we are going to shave our beards and make stalker mustaches in solidarity. And these mustaches, as the week went on, got more and more elaborate until every woman and guy who could not produce a mustache of their own had Sharpie mustaches. I had a Sharpie mustache. And we got to the end of the week. We took a big picture as a group. most of the people ended up shaving off their mustaches, except for the few that decided they really liked their mustache. And the community reset. And we were able to go another 3 weeks until another person hit the wall, and I can't remember what. Oh, we had a mock Olympic Games to help compensate for that one. And so you create something that kind of helps build that community and helps release some of that tension.
I read a book about hallucinations once, and it said that a lot of people hallucinate when they're like stuck in the same dreary landscape. Is it like really common for people to see things and hear things? Like, because even like any sense deprivation, like if you guys don't have a lot of noise, and you can have like auditory hallucinations and stuff.
So that's the bird on the front of the sleigh. There's a really common one that happens on both the North and South Pole. You'll either get a bird or an old man that will sit on the top in the front of your sleigh and will keep you awake and conscious until you can get back to civilization. A lot of scientists will tell you it's not a hallucination. It's real. There are stories that are told about various people's experience with the old man or the bird. So that's, is it a hallucination? Most likely. Are the people who experience it going to believe that it's a hallucination? Oh no.
Sorry, I get to actually play neuroscientist and mythology freak for a second. Super excited. I never get to do both. But these hallucinations are common under a variety of circumstances, namely sleep deprivation or sensory kind of the sameness, which you can imagine being on a sled. Oh, look, it's white. Oh, look, it's a gray sky. Oh, look, that's white stuff in the sky for hours on end. Now, these are called release hallucinations. They are definitely a biological phenomenon in that when our body is not getting a certain amount of stimulus, it just makes it up. And this might actually be one of the reasons for restless leg, is our body's like, well, why aren't you moving? You're awake, and then it forces you to move. But this happens if we go deaf, it happens if we're doing sensory deprivation, it happens if we're blind. But there is absolutely no reason why an auditory release hallucination or a visual release hallucination would be very specific and very stereotyped. In fact, they aren't. If you look at the data on, say, blind people or deaf people or sensory deprivation tanks, it's not consistent. It is kind of random. So, from my perspective, they're definitely having release hallucinations in the sense that there's something happening because of sensory deprivation. But there is absolutely no psychological or biological basis to explain the fact that they're all the same. And to me, that makes them real and not just release hallucinations.
I'm hallucinating right now.
I was just going to ask, is it conceivable that a society could exist, a human society could exist without mythology? Without creating these justifications for the things that they do and so on? It's not no.
Well, look, mythology is a product of oral cultures. So, I already told you how it would work. I mean, the story would be when Shimu never sets, Gihor, the frost giant, crawls out of his cave and roars and cackles and turns the mountains into water. That would be an explanation of the ice-off period, where you hear the sound and that the rivers start flowing, and it's personified in an ice ogre, right? And when Shimu never sets, the sun. So this is how it starts getting promulgated in oral societies. In literate societies, we wouldn't do that. For me personally, mythology in Antarctica requires an isolated oral society. A modern society would do something more rational. They would draw Sharpie mustaches on their lips and have, I bet there would be a lot of play in these societies. You would have to have a lot of play in order to survive, I would think.
But not risk-taking.
But not risk-taking.
So it looks like we have time for one more question.
That's just an interesting question. Isn't mythology play? I mean, aren't those rites play? because you've made a statement that a modern literate society wouldn't have mythology. The things you're describing, both here with sick children and the things you do, that they sound like rituals. They sound like stories are repeated. It sounds like you can have mythology.
All mythologies are acted out in some way. Song, dance, drama, chanting. I mean, oral societies are play acting societies. And also playful societies. And sometimes human sacrifice societies. There's that too.
Well, thank you so much for coming. I hope that you gained some insight, and I really hope that you're going to write and involve Antarctica or an ice planet or something similar in your writing.